Well, let's take a subsequent scene after he is detained at the airport because somebody thinks that he might be a terrorist. He's interrogated in a room at the airport. Let me play that scene.
What's the charge? Flying while Muslim?
No, that's not the charge.
I was joking. Muslims around the world are known for their sense of humor.
I did not know that.
That was another joke.
Oh! What is that? Some kind of signal?
No, that's because you didn't get the...
You lived for over a year in Afghanistan.
I was volunteering with a development agency.
Why did you leave your father's law firm?
While I was in Egypt doing my Islamic studies, I found my true calling.
Explosives?
Yeah, explosives. Look, I am going to the town of Mercy to work as an imam. You know, like a priest. Hold on, I can prove it.
Hey.
I have the ad that I answered for the job. You can call the mosque if you like. If the story doesn't check out, you can deport me to Syria.
Hey, you do not get to choose which country we deport you to.
It's a scene from Little Mosque on the Prairie, and as we could hear, both the people doing the interrogating and the imam who's being interrogated are completely misunderstanding each other every step of the way. Mm-hmm. What kind of response did you get to that scene?
Well, it's interesting. That scene was actually inspired by the Maher Arar case in Canada. I don't know if you know about that case, but a Canadian citizen who was on his way back home, he had been away on vacation and he had to travel through New York to come back home, was arrested by American authorities and in collusion with the Canadian authorities, was deported to Syria, where he was imprisoned and tortured for 1 year. And this man was completely innocent, and eventually he was exonerated. He was returned back to Canada because of the efforts of his wife. And it was a huge issue in Canada. How could we have allowed this to happen to one of our own? That we would have allowed these sort of stereotypes to cloud our judgment, that we would have sent a man that was innocent of these charges to a country, to be tortured. And so to me, that was saying something that I felt I had to comment about. And so I wrote, we wrote this scene together, myself and the writers, about, being interrogated, by a Canadian police officer. And some people felt that maybe, that scene, took the issue too far. But, there were different responses. Some people thought it was absolutely hilarious and loved it because it made the point absolutely as it should have. And other people felt that, did I go too far with that scene? So it was interesting to me how people responded, because it was a very, politically sensitive scene, because, you're actually talking about something that had happened to someone and it affected someone's life. And, to me, that's the only way for me to deal with it is through a comedic take on it, so that people can understand how serious it was for one person.
Now, in the second episode of Little Mosque on the Prairie, which I have not yet seen, the older imam, who's from Pakistan, wants to erect a barrier in the mosque to separate the women from the men.
Right.
Now, you actually made a documentary called Me and the Mosque about how more and more mosques in Canada have been erecting partitions between the men and the women, and that even happened in your mosque. Would you describe the change in your mosque and how that affected your experience of praying there?
Well, when I first came to Regina, women prayed behind the men, and there was no issue about that. Nobody even questioned it. But as our community started to grow, and we started getting more conservative immigrants coming to our community, there, people started talking about how this wasn't really Islamic, it wasn't really appropriate, women shouldn't really be seen by the men. And it's, at first I was like, okay, we can fight this. This isn't really going to really affect us in any way, except that the voices started getting louder and louder. And at one point, I think we had a visiting imam from Saudi Arabia, which is a very conservative country from an Islamic point of view, come down and say publicly that what we were doing was wrong. And this sort of emboldened the more conservative members of our community. And one day, I came to the mosque, and there's this shower-like curtain hanging where the women are praying, and we're expected to pray behind it. And that's when the problem started. Some of the women wanted to show that we weren't going to accept this decision, and so we prayed in front of it to show that it was unacceptable to us. And I admit that there were some women who preferred it and wanted a more private space, so they prayed behind it. But I felt that, it wasn't fair that it was a unilateral decision where everyone had to pray behind it, and that there should be some accommodation for women who wanted to pray, in front of it without a barrier between them and the khatib, the leader of the prayer.
What kind of explanation did your imam give you about why there was suddenly a barrier between the men and the women?
The explanation is always like, well, it's just a more Islamic thing. Women don't dress properly anymore. Men are more distracted. We're in the West. Things are more loose and lax, and we've got to tighten things up. And, because they can't really defend it from theology because, there was never a barrier during the time of the Prophet. Men and women interacted freely with each other. There was a much more normal behavior. Like I read stories of the time of the Prophet, and women, used to speak up, used to ask men questions, used to ask, they couldn't hear the Prophet, they'd ask the men to repeat it, they would challenge each other. There was this normalcy between them, they still preserved their modesty, but there was more of an interaction between them, which I feel has disappeared now from many aspects of the Muslim culture.
This is, from what I've read, this is like the first Muslim sitcom in North America.
Yeah, as far as I know.
Are you the only Muslim on the writing staff?
I am. We don't have, like I mentioned before, Muslims going into the entertainment field. They're very few and far in between. So I don't think we really have any, or maybe extremely few Muslim writers in Canada. And because we are Canadian and we protect our cultural product, we have certain rules, which means we don't use writers from other countries. Like in the U.S., there's no rules like that. You don't have to protect your cultural product because you have global dominance.
We're king.
You are. And we compete
we rule
against
the world
you.
in pop culture.
You absolutely do. And the only way to protect, if we didn't have those rules, I think everyone would automatically cast Brad Pitt in every film they could if they're going to get Canadian funding. So our rules are we use, Canadian actors, Canadian writing teams to keep the cultural product Canadian. And so what that does, also means that it's difficult to find Muslim writers. But in a way, I think that it's an advantage to us because bringing in other writers from different faith communities opens up the writing and makes sure that it's not insular, that people can't relate to the subject matter, that, we do tell stories that have to do with Muslim communities, but it's not written in such a way that you would have to belong to that community to understand, because, ultimately this show is going to be seen by the non-Muslim community in order for it to survive and get the ratings to carry on. So we have to make it as universal and accessible as possible. What I'm trying to do is bring a better understanding between two communities that really, really need a chance to look at each other and laugh at each other and bridge the gaps of paranoia that exists right now. And that, for every, kooky Muslim I have in my show, I have an equally kooky non-Muslim. So sort of an equal opportunity show for all people.